You are an associate professor of political philosophy in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Prior to this, you were postdoc research associate in values and public policy at Princeton University, and you received a DPhil in philosophy from the University of Oxford. It's quite a bio. It always makes me think about my own bio when I read ones like this. Just amazing, Andreas, that you have done so much. You say about yourself, I think and write about moral and political philosophy and the philosophy of public policy. I'm particularly interested, you say, in socio-political freedom, consequentialism, distributive justice, egalitarianism, behavioral policies, public health, long-termism, and animal ethics. I can imagine a dinner party with you would be quite fun, Andreas. You're the director of the PPE Masters in Groningen and a board member of the PPE Center as well, of course, philosophy, politics, and economics. But most of all, Andreas, you are so very welcome today. It's 17:08. The time is yours for 10 minutes. The stage is yours, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Great, Richard. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Let me share my screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Right now.
Now, here we go. That's been enabled. Okay, you should also be seeing my slides. Good. So I prepared an 8-minute presentation, but given that I'm giving a slow introduction and had to share my screen, this might still work out with 10. Okay, good. So nudging. Let me start by offering a few words, if my slides changes, there we go, on what nudging means. So Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein have popularized the term nudging in their famous book, Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. And so the way I read the term is that nudges are a type of intervention that improve people's decisions by changing their choice architecture. And they do so without banning or replacing options and without significantly changing economic incentives. Now, so let's start with what it isn't. So anything, any kind of intervention, paternalist or otherwise, where you take away options, you prohibit stuff or you replace them with others, or whether you slap on a big subsidy or a big tax or something, those are not nudges, right? These are more traditional tools and policy. Nudges, on the other hand, they make small changes to the way the options are presented. So they don't take away the options, they don't replace them, they don't prohibit, they don't incentivize stuff economically, thinking about, the homo economicus, the rational agent. Instead, they just make small changes to the choice architecture, to the way options are presented. Also, a final word on what nudges aren't. So like something that is extremely manipulative, for example, propaganda or something, right? Or like shaming people into doing something. These are also not nudges, right? They're not small changes to the choice architecture, right? They're quite significant interventions, right? So they wouldn't qualify as nudges either, right? So outright manipulation, propaganda, and lying, those are not nudges, right? It's just we're on the same page. Good. Nudges, and I'm so far speaking mostly about public policy, which is where I come from, but a lot of that will translate to private business. They have several advantages, right? So one of them is that they preserve freedom of choice, because you don't take away options, right? You don't replace them, you don't have prohibitions, you don't have strong changes to the options you have. You preserve people's option freedom, the options they are free to choose. That makes them quite attractive in political context, particularly in liberal societies where people value freedom of choice strongly. And it makes them attractive when you have kind of partisan gridlock, right? Where you might have a left-right divide or some other divides where people can't really agree. Interventions that kind of preserve freedom of choice tend to be more acceptable also to people, to populations, but also to sort of politicians and political parties. They're relatively cheap and simple, right? So they don't require huge changes, they're small changes to the choice environment, and they don't cost all that much money compared to, say, using subsidies or something. And another big advantage is both in public policy, but also for private business, that they're quite suitable for evidence-based policy, right? So you can relatively straightforwardly, at least with many of them, test which ones work and which ones do not, right? For example, through simple A and B testing or randomized controlled trials and so on. So they're quite suitable if you want to place great weight on evidence in your decision making. Good. The topic today is also green, like sustainability nudges, right? So like using nudging for sustainability. And let me give you a few examples, and that way I can give examples of what nudging is in general, but also what sustainability nudges are in particular. So a very common type of nudge is a default nudge. So that's where you change which option is the status quo nudge, right? For example, a classic example is printer settings, right? So if you, very often companies have the default setting when you print on one-sided, right? But if you change the default to two-sided, the share of people who will print their paper doubles on both sides will go up drastically. Second example, so there was a town in the Black Forest in Germany, I forgot the name, Grünau or something like that. I forgot exactly what the name was, but like a town in southern Germany, they decided to change the default, the energy default, from non-renewable energy to renewable energy. So they decided that democratically in one of their sort of council meetings and so on. And then the share of people who stuck with renewable energy was very high. It was above 90%. So they really made a difference in terms of the number of households using renewable energy. You could have other defaults, for example, have the defaults that people, when they fly for your company, always, for example, must book carbon offsetting. What we do in my faculty here in Groningen here is we have a vegan or vegetarian default for all our conferences and all our food. So that's what some students, one of my colleagues instituted, and that's worked very well. So like the amount of meat being consumed in our faculty has gone down massively. So there's very little meat being consumed now at conferences. At the same time, you can still order, if you organize a conference here in our faculty, you can still eat meat, but you have to sort of then fill in like an extra, tick some extra box and say why you would like to have a meat option. So those are default nudges. Other nudges, sort of like another important kind of benefit of the nudge approach, it's not necessarily only thinking about like positive interventions, but kind of correcting for bad choice architecture, right? Because choice architecture hasn't been given the systematic attention that it deserves. There might just be many kind of accidental or intentional choice architectures out there in private business and elsewhere that just incentivize or get people to systematically choose options that are less good, For example, in many contexts, for example, the default food option might be like the meat option or the default size, or something like this, and then you could just change these things. Or the default traveling option for something might always be the flight first, or might be business class first rather than a economy class, which is environmentally preferable and so on. So there you can just sort of correct choice architecture. And finally, an important type of nudge, although some people debate is that really still a nudge, but I think definitely falls in the umbrella of the nudge approach, is to make existing interventions more effective through choice architecture and then through like data-based kind of controls or like randomized control trials and so on. For example, if you have certain kind of behavior that you really want, right? So like environmentally friendly behavior, there might just be different ways to try to people to get it, right? Convince people to do so, right? And you might also just worry, how can you increase compliance in your customers or in other target populations? And nudging kind of provides some good kind of heuristics on how typically you can get people to comply more or to follow certain norms, right? And they can use this sort of nudge approach to try to sort of more effectively influence people to be more compliant with norms, or how to like change norms towards environmentally friendly norms. Good. Now let's some points for discussion: AI and private nudging. So that's nudging in the private business. Just one sort of critical point I would just want to make here first is that sustainability is of course a huge topic, and climate change is kind of one of the central challenges for humanity at the moment. So there is no way around drastic changes, right? And significant changes to economic incentives, right? So effective nudges are kind of effective, and you can study how effective they are, but the effect size is usually somewhat moderate, right? The field of application is growing. There are lots of more applications. However, in something as drastic and important as climate change, particularly if we consider how much more like countries like India and China will grow, and the African continent, there will be so much more economic growth, which is great. But of course, there will be more greenhouse gas emissions. We, of course, need more drastic changes, right? So one risk I would warn against when talking about nudges is sort of the risk of overselling what we can do and cannot do with it. Two more points. I just want to ask questions. I'm not going to answer them, right? Is the question, is it really the role of private business to affect behavior change, right? So in democratic societies, at least, the state, to some extent, the government, particularly when done transparently and democratically, has some form of mandate to do something about climate change and environmental degradation and so on. So there might be something of a democratic mandate. The question now is, do private business have the same mandate, right? Like in market economies, they have a clear mandate to offer products on the market, right? Products and services, and to seek profit amongst other goals. But do they really have the right mandate to pursue this sort of like social, societal goals? And then also, do they offer the right transparency? Particularly when we use nudges driven by artificial intelligence, there's sometimes a worry that there's like a black box, right? That we don't really see how did we arrive at a particular choice architecture, because ultimately it's not really humans anymore who just say we're doing this or that, right? For those reasons, if it's driven by an algorithm, we might worry that there is less transparency, and that kind of an underway, in some way, risks their democratic legitimacy. And finally, we should always be mindful of the question that private businesses have other incentives. Of course, they have the incentive of seeking profit. So then the question is, if we leave the role strongly to private business, how compatible are the incentives, right? So there are lots of examples of businesses using behavioral techniques, right? For a long time, just like already before nudging came along, of course, companies have used behavioral techniques in a way that is, that will improve their profits, and sometimes also in ways that is bad for customers, like, for example, locking them into like really year-long gym contracts, knowing that the people won't show up and so on. So there is always a risk that companies will use these nudges or these techniques in a way that is to seek profit. And then the question is, how compatible is it if we ask private business to pursue these sustainability goals when at the same time they have other goals, right? So this is the final question that I'm sure will come back in this discussion later on, but that's something that we should be mindful of. Great, thank you.
Hi, Andreas. Thank you. Thank you so much for your lovely opening talk. And this gives an idea to people definitely of what nudging is and what it isn't. We understand the choice architecture, but there are many questions behind nudging that we need to consider with respect to the questions that you have rightly raised about the democratic mandate or the transparency, and what role businesses will be playing in terms of digital nudging. Even though the definition says it has to give the freedom of choice and options, shouldn't take it away. But I think there is more detail to this. What are the pros and cons of digital nudging, and how we are going to look at in the greener world or in the sustainability area of it. So I would hand over to, and thank you for your talk, and we will see it, how we can expand this thought in the panel discussion. Over to you, Richard.